All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for jumping in. Look, I am ecstatic to get together with a good friend of mine, Shikata, who's been doing some incredible stuff with, hey, network penetration testing, super sweet hacks. And Shikata, I don't know if you're up for it, but we might be able to get like a little bit of a series here, a couple of videos, and some content you've been willing to put together and prepare. So thank you again and again for it. But what's on your mind? What are you up to? What can we dive into?
Yeah, so great to be back here again. Today, I wanted to bring on and introduce vulnerabilities and configurations in a severely vulnerable and commonly misconfigured Windows service called Active Directory Certificate Services. For those that don't know me, I am one of the directors of internal network penetration testing at IBM X-Force Red. And this is honestly, this series of vulnerabilities that we're about to talk about, or just these configurations in general, are probably one of the biggest ways that companies have had environments misconfigured over the past decade, 2 decades, that they've just slowly misconfigured these systems. Now, SpectreOps only released all this research a few years back, but we're going to go into, some theory at first. So we're going to jump into some picture heavy slides, and then we're going to jump right into some live demos and command execution in a lab as well. So it should be a fun time. So before we dive in to the hands-on or even what is Active Directory Certificate Services, I wanted to give a brief overview. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard these topics or understand topics like asymmetric encryption, but I wanted to give a brief overview of it. So in asymmetric encryption, you have two different keys. You have a public key and you have a private key. And the public key, so if I, create a public-private key pair myself, I'm going to keep the private key to myself and hide it away. And then I'm going to give out that public key to say to you, John. And then you will be able to, encrypt the data with the public key, and then I'll be able to decrypt it with my private keys. I'm sure most people know these basics, but just getting that baseline set down. How do you think, how is key exchange normally done? That's like the first question I have before we get into like certificates.
How do you mean? Like, hey, someone encrypts something with their own private key, they validate it with their public key, kind of back and forth handoff? Or
If I was to, how do I verify from my perspective that you aren't a threat actor and I'm sending you encrypted data? So we do this key exchange where I give you my public key and you encrypt data with it and then send it to me. How do I verify that you are who you say you are, that the keys that we've given each other are actually from you? How do you verify my public key is actually from me and you're talking to me?
oh, goodness. I guess you'd be looking at my public key at that point, right? Or some, I don't know, what is it, PGP, pretty good privacy stuff, GPG in the mix, or I
Yeah.
guess in my mind.
So this is like a complex issue, but this is where we get into something called root of trust. And that's a whole other topic outside of the scope of this video. But before we can get into Active Directory certificate services, we need to know what a certificate is, and that directly correlates to a public-private key pair. You can think of a certificate as kind of this information that I can send you that in a way verifies that my certificate is who I say I am. To kind of back up, we have on the left side here, we have our public key, and that's going to be me. And we have a certificate authority on the right. And a certificate authority is an entity that has its own private key. And I'm going to take my public key, maybe some identifying information here, like my name or my email, and I'm going to generate, or maybe my domain, like google.com. And of course, I have my private key, but then I'm going to generate a certificate signing request. And then I'm going to send that to the certificate authority. The certificate authority is going to do some things of making sure I am who I say I am before it does things. And then it's going to use its private key to sign the certificate signing request. So it's going to take its private key and sign the certificate signing request. And so now that is a signed certificate. One thing that this image is missing is that the applicant in this case would have the public key of the certificate authority on their system. How would I verify the certificate is valid if I have the public key of the certificate authority on my system?
I am not smart. I don't know
No,
enough
you're
of
good.
ADCS and the CA shenanigans to know for sure.
So I would use the certificate authority's public key to verify that the certificate is the signature is correct and that nothing has changed. If we go back, this is where that problem that I mentioned earlier called root of trust comes in. And essentially every computer, your Windows computer, all these different entities, there's entities called root certificate authorities, and their public keys and their certificates are default installed as root certificate authorities on everybody's machines. And any certificate that is signed with those public keys on your system will be trusted. So that's where that root of trust issue comes in, but that's a whole other thing. So this is one way of how we verify that the certificates or the public private keys that you're sending me are correct. So you could go to a place like DigiCert, or you could go to Let's Encrypt and be like, hey, I need a certificate. And then you could generate your public private key pair and then get a certificate saying that that public key is from you. And as long as I trust Let's Encrypt, then I will know that the keys you send me are correct. Does that make sense? Are there any questions?
I'm good so far, I think. Obviously, screenshots and lecture is its own thing, but I think
Yep.
when we get down to tactical, hey, hands on keyboard stuff, it'll be much more clear, I think.
Okay, awesome. Close to getting hands on keyboard. Let's just now tie that together with Active Directory certificate services.
Hey, real quick, before we go any further, please let me take just a quick moment to tell you about the sponsor of today's video. Let's be honest, passwords are still a mess. Forgotten logins, weak credential reuse, reset tickets clogging up the help desk, it's a nightmare, and attackers know it. That's why I'm a fan of SpecOps software. They take password security from reactive to proactive. With their breached password protection, you're blocking over 4 billion compromised passwords, updated daily from real-world leaks, live attacks, and even malware botnets. And it's not just password resets. SpecOps actively scans your Active Directory environment and flags compromised passwords the same day they show up in the wild. You can even build custom block lists so users can't set passwords with your company name, project code names, or that one sports team that everyone's obsessed with in the office. And for the end users, they get dynamic feedback that helps them choose strong passwords that meet policy without the guessing game. Fewer bad passwords, fewer help desk tickets. Throw in self-service password reset and built-in multi-factor authentication, and suddenly passwords aren't your weakest link anymore. They're just one more thing you've locked down smart. Check out SpecOps software and get started with my link below in the video description, jh.live/SpecOps. Huge thanks to SpecOps for sponsoring this video.
Close to getting hands on keyboard. Let's just now tie that together with Active Directory certificate services. So, a certificate, in theory, being able to prove that a public key belongs to an entity, right? We can then use that to do various things. If I can prove that the thing you sent me is you, that's almost like a verification, a authentication, maybe something like that. You proved an identity. So Active Directory certificate services is a way of, at a high level, it's Microsoft's way of implementing public key infrastructure into Microsoft Active Directory. And under normal circumstances, at least externally on the web, certificates are normally used for things such as verifying that the domain you're connecting to is actually google.com, right? And verifying that the data you're sending to google.com is actually only being decrypted by google.com. But as I was mentioning earlier, certificates can be used for more things such as authentication or encryption, because a public key can be used to encrypt things. We can use certificates to verify keys for encryption. So Active Directory certificate services is a Microsoft implementation of that. And that's exactly what we have. But because certificates have these inherent configurations on the internet, when we apply those same configurations locally inside of an Active Directory environment, issues happen. So to kind of go over that same process quickly, at a high level, ADCS works by a client generating that public-private key pair, and then they issue a certificate signing request. And that certificate signing request, you can see, has a few things like a template, and we'll get to templates later, but a template is essentially a group of settings that apply to that certificate. And one setting would be, can the certificate be used for authentication or encryption or signing, right? So that template might specify this certificate can only be used for authentication, not encryption. The subject, that would be your username in this case, and some other things like extended key usage. And then your public key. And you send that to the Active Directory certificate server and that and that certificate signing request, or CSR. And the certificate authority is going to be like, does that template exist? I'm going to call this template authentication exist? And is that user allowed to enroll in that certificate? And if all those things succeed, then a certificate is generated. Then the certificate authority signs that certificate with its private key and sends it back to the client. Now the client has a certificate that they can use to do things within a Windows environment or even more. So there's some high level there. We'll get into some nitty gritty specifics here soon. That at a high level makes sense. That
That
back and forth.
does. Is the template super duper important? Because like in all reality, I guess that would kind of define what capability certificate would have, right?
Yes, the templates become very important here in just a little bit. So good pickup. As long as this high level overview is understood, though, we're good to go. So now getting on to a little bit about templates. You can see on the right here, this is what a template looks like, the way an attacker would see it. And you can see that it's like a blueprint of valid settings and options, features, and permissions that can be specified when generating a certificate. So let's like on the right here, you can see extended key usage or your EKU. This certificate called user authentication up here at the top can be used for authentication. It can be used for encrypting file systems and securing emails. So that's what this certificate could be used for. So if I had one, I could authenticate with it. And if we go down to enrollment rights here, these enrollment rights, you can see that, every domain user can fetch a certificate with this template, right? So that's what our enrollment rights would be. And that's very important because we have to, with whatever user we're authenticating as, we have to have the permissions to fetch a certificate with this template. Make sense?
Tracking so far.
Okay. All right. Why don't we go straight to the command line here, and then we're going to explain a few attacks. One of my favorites first. So let's go to here. And we're going to just jump into some initial recon here before we actually get into that attack that I was mentioning before. And just to give some context, the way we're going to approach this environment is that we know nothing about the environment right now. We're going to try and get some information, and then we're going to move from there. And we're going to try a few different attacks. And throughout this video series, we're going to see that, this attack gave us DA. But then after that, we're going to walk back and pretend that we didn't get DA through that attack after we understand it. And then we're going to go at it from another perspective to understand another attack vector. So to just start, I'm going to, if this was a machine placed in their network, I would look in my etcresolve.com. I'd see that the name server is 172.161.2. In an Active Directory environment, what is likely the name server configuration to also be?
It's usually also the domain controller itself.
Exactly.
Right?
So we can then go in here and then let's just go 161.2.
So for some added context, you're using NXC, which is NetExec, right? Hey, the
Yeah.
sweet, cool pen testing little Swiss Army knife to be a successor of Crack Map Exec. Using SMB, the server message block protocol, port 445 to see, are there shares open accessible? Or could we get any sweet intel like the host name, the domain info, etc.?
Exactly. No, that's exactly what we're doing. And NXC uses that in packet library. So there's going to be a lot of things like signatures for this tool. So that's always something to be careful of. But in this case, we used it to connect over SMB, and also it connects over 135 as well. And we fetch some information such as the domain. And that's kind of important. We know that, DC01, this is probably a domain controller. I want to fetch some other things about the environment. And so I'm going to type out let's use the DNS SRB enum script. And then this is going to enumerate SRB records for DNS. So this is going to look in my local etcresolve.com for those DNS servers, and then it's going to go to those DNS servers and ask for SRB records. And you can see when we ask for the SRB records, we get a list of domain controllers. And we see there's only one domain controller, at least in this domain. The reason this works is because we can go in and it's like, hey, where's the Kerberos service? And where's the LDAP? Where's the SIP service? And those are like the SRB records are like a standard way to find things in environments. So now we know, okay, there's only one domain controller. That's nice. If I was to maybe nmap here and let's go look at, I don't know, let's go for 445. And just for time's sake, we could go about this through the entire environment, but let's also look at and see 172.161.1.3. So in this case, what I would have done, just for time's sake, I would have nmapped the environment, our scope, and then I would have gone through the host with 445 open and then connected them through SMB to do some initial enumeration. What does this host look like by its host name?
Given the host name, I'm going to think that's our certificate authority.
Exactly. That's our certificate authority. So to walk us back, let's go back to the presentation just for 1 second. Let's go to and let's look at what's called a ADCS HTTP endpoint. And the reason this is important is because when these series of attacks first came out, this was kind of like the instant shebang, get domain admin instantly. So we're going to start off with a bang. Now, escalation 8 is just what SpectreOps called this, but specifically this is a net NTLM relay to a Active Directory Certificate Services HTTP enrollment endpoint. That's a mouthful, so let's break it down. Active Directory Certificate Services, when you want a certificate, you can do something called web enrollment, which means you go to this website on the certificate authority, enter your username and password, and then you can get your own certificate. But let's try and see if web enrollment is enabled. First, I'm going to look for port 80 on this certificate authority, and let's see if it's there. All right, it's open.
Is
We
that
could
common? Is that the like default setup and structure?
That is not the default setup. You do have to install this as an additional role when you install Active Directory Certificate Services, but it is very common. I would say, on average, 7 out of every 10 environments will have HTTP enrollment enabled. That doesn't mean it's always vulnerable to what we're going to go over, but in likelihood, it's definitely one of your strongest things. So we're going to go to that 172.168.1.3, and we're going to go to this directory, cert serve, and oh, cool. So let me just first go to it without cert serve. You can see it's a IIS server. But when we go to cert serve, we're prompted for authentication. So from an unauthenticated perspective, we can have a strong hunch that this certificate authority is running a HTTP enrollment endpoint. So let's log in. I'm going to log in with a credential that I already know just for demonstration purposes on what this would look like. And this is what we would see. Now, we do need to actually send a post request here, but if a user was to log into this page, they could use it to, request a certificate with a certain template and then do all this stuff by hand. Now, obviously, from our perspective, we don't have a login to this, so we can't do that. That was just for demonstration purposes. You can see that that is there. So going back to our terminal, we can start to do some things from an unauthenticated perspective. Firstly, I'm going to go up and boot up Responder. And Responder is essentially a tool that responds to things. You can coerce authentication from different things, and then it'll just respond and get that authentication. So I'm going to boot up Responder here, and we're going to look for a specific issue, knowing that ADCS is in the system. And again, Active Directory Certificate Services being this thing that allows you to log in and then generate a certificate, right? So let's quickly go over something called authentication coercion. In this case, forced authentication coercion. RPC calls are kind of like the Windows API. You can do things on a Windows system with RPC calls, kind of like a web API, right? And there are specific endpoints. Microsoft EFS RPC being one of them, and that stands for Encrypted File System Remote Procedure Call. And this protocol, you essentially on the right in this picture, you can see we're going to connect, in this case, a domain controller over a named pipe, unauthenticated or authenticated. And then we're going to say, hey, domain controller, can you decrypt this encrypted file on this system? And that's called sending your EFS open file raw command. Then the domain controller is going to be like, yeah, I got you. I can decrypt that file. First, I need to log into that system that you just told me to go to. And then it's just going to go and attempt to log in. And this is what's known as forced authentication coercion. So we're going to something, we're saying, hey, I need you to do this thing. And then it's like, sure, I got that. I got to go authenticate first. Now, there was this bug in Windows that you could do a specific authentication coercion from an unauthenticated perspective. Unauthenticated, meaning no authentication, and get the domain controller to send you its machine account or to negotiate a NetNTLM version 2 connection, authenticated session to you from an unauthenticated perspective. And what might make the machine account of the domain controller important? What permissions might that have?
I mean, that is essentially like, oh, full access to that machine. And being the domain controller, then you kind of have the keys to the kingdom there, right? That's just a
Yeah,
one shot sprint to domain admin or anything else.
exactly. So we have the coerced connection. Now it's a NetNTLM version 2 of a domain controller's machine account. We're going to relay it somewhere. Where did we just go over that accepts authentication?
Our certificate authority, right?
Yeah, on port 80. And it just so happens that a cross protocol relay from SMB to port 80 is actually perfectly fine. So we're going to attempt to use unauthenticated petit patam, what the attack's called, to coerce first the domain controller to say, hello, I need to decrypt a file on the attacker's system. And then when we get that, we're going to say, you need to authenticate first. Domain controller is going to authenticate to us, and we're going to relay that straight to the Active Directory certificate server and then log in as the domain controller to the web enrollment endpoint. This is the full walkthrough of the bug on this picture on the right. Relay that to the web enrollment endpoint, and then we're logged in as the domain controller. We can then get a certificate as the domain controller's machine account if this is successful. So let's go try it. First, we're going to see if unauthenticated petit patam works. So for that, I'm just going to use petit patam. And for context, from an unauthenticated standpoint, this is patched, but from an authenticated standpoint, this is default Windows. So we're going to say, I need the domain controller to connect back to 172.16.1.254. And we're going to connect to the domain controller at 172.16.1.2. And we're going to specify, we're going to try over all named pipes. Beautiful. All right. So you can see on the right here, we connected to the domain controller and we sent the EFS open file raw commands. And then the domain controller attempted to authenticate to us here. And you can see we got a NetNTLM version 2 over the SMB protocol. So SMB, NetNTLM version 2. So we know that authentication coercion, forced authentication coercion, is possible. But let's go and let's do the relay. So I'm going to use NTLM relay x.py. And we're going to use tag T. We're going to specify that HTTP or that HTTP enrollments. And we're going to go here, and that's the host name of the certificate authority. And then we're going to relay it specifically to cert SRV and then cert FNSH dot ASP. We're going to tell NTM relay here that we're using a Active Directory certificate services and our template. Remember how you have to specify template, and the template that we're going to use is that of the domain controller. And we're also going to specify SMB2 support, so we can specify enable SMB2. We're going to set that up. So now we have something that's going to relay to the Active Directory certificate service server, attempt to log in when we coerce that credential, and then get a certificate as the domain controller. Now we can go here, and I'm going to execute petit patam again. I'm not going to do it with all pipes because we only need it once. In theory, this should go from, and I just want to put this context, from no access whatsoever to having full control of an account, a very important account. We see we executed petit patam there, and we authenticated as the domain controller. You can see that right here. And then we generated that certificate signing request. It says it's generated, and then we get the certificate. So meaning we generated that certificate signing request after we're authenticated, sent it over. Domain control or the certificate authority was like, yep, that sounds good. Here's your certificate. So now that we have this certificate, that kind of gives us, certificates are only valid for a certain amount of time, at least I'm pretty sure these are. And we could use this certificate to do things. What do you think we could do with this certificate?
I mean, I'd love to use it for authentication if that is something that it's got that capability for. Hey, could we just straight up log in now to the domain controller?
Yes, but first, and technically we don't need to do this first, but this is something that's very, it's important. So inside of Microsoft, one thing that SpectreOps discovered a few years back was this thing that they called Theft5, or what's known as unpack the hash. Essentially, there's this protocol called Kerberos. It's an authentication protocol. And if you authenticate over Kerberos using PK in it, so public key, your public private keys, so essentially using a certificate over Kerberos, there's a built-in fail-safe that allows the user to obtain their NetNTLM hash to support legacy authentication. Essentially, if we authenticate over Kerberos and all we have is their certificate, using some methodology that we don't really have time to go into, we can then essentially get the NT hash. And this involves decrypting what's called the hack credential data structure that we have access to inside of the protocol. But you can think about it that if we authenticate over Kerberos with a certificate, the domain controller or the certificate authority will essentially be like, oh, cool, here's the NT hash, have it, giving us essentially persistent access to that account until the password is changed. Because I know we haven't had time to go into it here, but an NT hash is just as good as a password in a Windows environment because of the way the authentication protocols work. And if you're curious, these are the resources, but don't really have time to dive into all of the specifics of unpack the hash, but it is fascinating how it works. And I do recommend whoever's watching to go and look into that. So we have this certificate, and now we're going to authenticate with this. So we're going to specify certify and then auth, specify that PFX, and we're going to go and specify that certificate. And so now you can see we're trying to use the certificate here to get a TGT. So we're authenticating over Kerberos. And once we have that TGT, again, it's going to use unpack the hash, or the methodology of unpack the hash, but essentially uses unpack the hash to get the NT hash of the account. So now we can use the NT hash to authenticate to the domain controller as itself. So let's do that real quick. Let's just prove that works. 172.16.1.2. And we're going to specify the username as index tech DC01 \$ tac h colon, and then we're going to do the hashes here, and we're going to specify that hash. And actually, we don't need that colon anymore. Let's see if it works.
Now, the dollar sign is important there because this is the machine account, correct?
Yes.
For that host. And when you use that capital H, hey, we can pass the hash. Very slick. Now, you're only using the latter half, kind of following the colon. I know that AAD3B4, whatever thing at the very start, that's just usually nothing, right?
So that's a good observation. These are two different hashes, actually. This is known as your LM hash on the left here, or your LAN manager hash. And on the right side of the colon is your NT hash. The left side of this is called the LM. The right side is called NT. If you put them together with a colon, what do you call it?
NTLM hash.
Yeah, you call it the NTLM. It's backwards. But this was default before, I think, Windows 2003. I don't
Yeah.
remember specifically.
Old.
But
Yeah.
this is a really bad hashing mechanism because these are essentially two different 7 character chunks. You can see that this is a blank LM hash. So it's all null bytes. And you can see that right here, AAD3B. And then we have AAD3B again. Those are those two different sections. So you can actually take these hashes offline and then brute force them in 7 character hash segments. But yes, so we don't need to use that because it's not really used for the authentication. So we have successful authentication to the domain controller as its machine account. Now, we could use this through two different means, or I mean, there's definitely more, but the two different means that come to mind to get domain admin. We essentially have administrative privileges, but how do you think we can use this to get domain admin? What critical privilege might the domain controller's machine account have over the domain that we're interested in?
I think, and this is totally a shot in the dark, but we could just kind of leverage the DC's power to, I don't know, replicate or DC sync equivalent to pull everything down. Is that right?
Exactly. No, you're exactly on the money there. When you have two domain controllers in an environment, and I create a user on, let's say, index DC01 right there, but I have another domain controller that's in, say, across the world in another office, they need to sync up the fact that that new user was created on DC01. And that syncing, in which this domain controller all the way across the world, it is done using a domain controller sync using those machine accounts. So essentially, domain controller's machine account can log in to a domain controller and say, hey, can you send me a copy of all of the configuration settings? That way I can have the latest copy. Now, it's a bit more complex than that with like schema masters and things, but the gist of it is that we can pull what's called the NTDS file, which is essentially a database of all domain credentials, including administrative credentials. So we could specify tac NTDS, and then we're going to dump a specific user here, 343 guilty spark, which is a domain admin. And we could also just dump administrator as well, but I want to dump this user. And in this case, we're going to log into the domain controller and we're going to only sync the 343 guilty Spark user. And this is, again, because a domain controller's machine account has what's called replication privileges as you specified over DRSU API. Now we can then use NXC to log in with administrative privileges to the domain. And if we specify 343 guilty spark and then that hash.
Just for added background on 343 guilty spark, because I know that seems semi-random. This is all from goad, however we want to say it, like the game of Active Directory. Is that right? This is sort of the lab environment to play.
So you did pick up the host name. This is the same Kali machine I use in my GoAd environment in my virtualization cluster. But this environment is not from GoAd.
Gotcha.
This is my own local environment. I won't
Super
say
cool.
what it's from, but this is a video game reference, and that's what the entire environment has built on.
Cool.
Oh, wait,
But
do
at
you know
least
the video game?
background context,
Yeah.
that 343 guilty spark is the domain admin account.
Yes. Yes.
Gotcha.
So after logging into the domain controller, we can see that we have successfully gotten the pwned, which means that we have one of the ways that NXC tests for administrative privileges is having read and write over the C dollar and admin dollar shares on a host. And we have that over the domain controller. So there's other ways to test for administrative privileges. Obviously, that's just the prime way that NXC tests. But now we have domain admin over the domain controller. And this was was a prime attack, meaning specifically the Petit Patam attack. To give you context, when Escalation 8 released, it accidentally released at the same time as this unauthenticated authentication coercion bug on the right. So suddenly, most environments that had this deployed were just suddenly vulnerable to a 0 to full domain compromise in 3 commands, or like attack paths. So like from no access, you just execute this, your domain admin. It was crazy. And Petit Patam still exists on the right, but from an authenticated perspective. If you have authentication to the environment, so a valid low privileged user, you can still execute Petit Patam in every environment in existence, usually, unless they have mitigations, which most don't. And Escalation 8, still super prevalent. The application of this is that, yes, you're probably not going to be able to go from forced authentication coercion to full domain admin in 3 commands anymore. But tomorrow, what we're going to go over is how could we use something like Responder to coerce credentials and then not need to relay them to SMB with port 445, SMB signing disabled, and just get their NT hashes, or some other attacks we can do to escalate with some different Active Directory certificate authority attacks. But yeah, just to give that context, that we went from 0 to full control over an environment, and this was only 3 years ago.
Well, sheesh, man. I mean, I guess the run through the tools, hey, we kind of got to leverage there. You did a little bit of Nmap, you did a little bit of NetExec. Petit Patam, of course, has its own sort of script and automated tooling there. And I thought I saw Certify, right?
Yes.
Hey, just kind of streamlining some of the certificates work in that environment.
Exactly. Yes. Certify being the kind of this Python based tool that uses Impacket, as everything does, to streamline the certificate side of Active Directory. And that's what this authentication flag does. So it's going to automatically authenticate with our certificate here. And then it's going to, authenticate over Kerberos. And then after it authenticates over Kerberos, its default implementation is to do a theft5 or unpack the hash using Kerberos nuances that we don't have time to go into.
Still super cool, man. And thank you so much for, I mean, again, in my mind, it's like one shot, like, oh, hey, start from nothing, get everything. Very, very cool. There's much more nuance in other scenarios, but we'll dive into those soon. And thank you for being willing to, I don't know, do the song and dance and drive the show here. I'll be the first to admit I'm not super sharp on ADCS, so I'm just ecstatic that you're, hey, helping me learn just as well. And looking forward to all the more that we can do. Thank you again and again.
Yeah, of course. No problem. I look forward to the next time.